This is a quick rundown on the daily life of slaves in ancient Greek households. The first thing we need to know is, where did these slaves come from? While there were a number of nationalities such as Egyptian, Persian, and Scythian, there were also a majority of Grecian slaves. Now, the Grecian slaves were typically people who had fallen into debt and so were sold into slavery or willingly went into slavery to pay off that debt. However, parents would also sell their children into slavery if they couldn't afford to take care of them. The non-Grecian slaves were typically prisoners of war that were not killed or sent back to their country, as well as slaves that were traded via the trade routes of the neighboring countries. What were the roles of slaves? The roles of slaves depended mainly on their gender. So male slaves did a lot of the physical and outdoor work. They would work in the fields, they would shop for the households, accompany the children to school, also care for the horses and or the livestock of the household, work in the garden, and be a handyman for the household. Female slaves, on the other hand, did more domestic tasks. They would cook, they would clean, they would act as nannies for the children, a lot of times being more present as a parental figure than the child's own parents were. And some would unfortunately be prostituted out as entertainment for the master of the household and his guests. The treatment of slaves depended mainly on their location, the city-state that they were in, and their masters. For instance, in Athens, there were a decent number of laws that actually protected slaves and their rights. For instance, like no harsh punishments, public humiliation. Those were not often found in Athens. And it was also really common in Athens to find slave owners that gave their slaves a comfortable place to sleep, good food, and even a way for them to make and save money so that they could buy their freedom. Sparta was a different story. Sparta was very harsh with their slaves. They were always at the risk of unpredictable massacres, very severely oppressed. Some slaves would be whipped and then chained and dragged through public spaces as a form of public humiliation if they disobeyed their masters. If you were getting sold into slavery in ancient Greece, you would be praying to whatever god you believed in that you'd get taken to Athens and not Sparta. Pretty much all over the nation, however, there were the same basic rules. Female slaves, much like the other females of the household, were not allowed to go out of the household by themselves. They always had to have a male companion, mainly male companion, but just another companion with them. Very rarely were two females allowed to go out by themselves. All slaves were also prohibited from marrying and having children without the master's consent. Though those slaves that were prostituted out, a lot of them did have children, and the master of that slave likely gave that slave some housing so she could raise her children, which, I mean, was kind of them. The slave owners could be as gentle or as harsh as they really wanted. There was in Athens rules, but there was still whippings were classic, something that happened probably daily in the city-state. Starvation, dehydration, going without a place to sleep for a night, all very common. And if by some chance a slave ran away and got caught, they would likely be branded with a hot iron, if not killed. So yeah, that was the life of slaves in ancient Greek. Not much better than any slavery anywhere else, but at least we don't have to worry about it as much anymore.